The gravel crunched under the tires of my truck, a sound that seemed too mundane for the scene unfolding before me. Blackwood Manor wasn't just a house, it was a declaration. Perched on a rocky promontory overlooking the moody coastline of Maine, it looked less like it was built on the land and more like it had erupted from it. A jagged piece of Gothic revival architecture that dared the Atlantic to do its worst. The air was thick with the smell of salt, pine, and wet stone. A persistent, gray mist clung to the gables and spires, making the entire structure seem as if it were slowly dissolving into the sky. I'm Liam Harding, an architect specializing in the resurrection of old buildings. I find beauty in decay, a story in the water stains and warped floorboards. When the Lancaster estate contacted me, I saw it as the project of a lifetime. The Lancasters were old money, the kind that was so entrenched it had become part of the local geology. Their family had occupied this house for over a century and a half, and now it was showing its age. Waiting for me at the massive oak door was Eleanor Lancaster. She was a woman who wore her 70-odd years like a bespoke coat, perfectly tailored, elegant, but offering no real warmth. Her silver hair was pinned in a tight chignon, and her eyes, the color of a winter sea, assessed me with a disquieting stillness. "Mr. Harding," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of any welcoming inflection. "You are punctual. I appreciate that." She led me inside. The air in the foyer was cold and still, carrying the scent of beeswax and something else, something faintly metallic and musty, like old secrets. A grand staircase swept upwards into the gloom of the second floor, and portraits of stern-faced Lancasters from generations past watched my every move from the paneled walls. Their eyes seemed to follow me, a gallery of silent judges. "The house requires significant work, as my solicitor explained," Eleanor stated, her hands clasped primly before her. "Structural reinforcement, addressing the damp, restoring the original woodwork. However, my primary directive is that the unique character of the house be preserved. My great-grandfather, Alastair Lancaster, was the architect. He had very specific ideas about flow and space." I nodded, my professional mind already cataloging the obvious. "Of course, Mrs. Lancaster. My goal is always to honor the original architect's vision while ensuring the structure is safe and sound for the next century." Her lips formed something that might have been a smile on another person. On her, it was just a slight rearrangement of her features. "Excellent. Alastair believed a house should be more than a home. He believed it should be an experience." She left me to begin my initial survey, a process I always started alone. It's a way of getting to know the building, of listening to its groans and settling sounds without distraction. I had the original blueprints, a thick roll of yellowed paper, but I always started with a physical walkthrough to get a feel for the place. I began in the West Wing, historically the service quarters. The kitchen was a cavernous space with a massive, cold hearth. Beyond it, I checked my blueprints and located what was marked as a service passage. I found the doorway narrow and unassuming. Stepping through, I was immediately struck by a sense of wrongness. The corridor was short, no more than 15 feet long, and claustrophobically narrow. The floor, made of smooth, worn stone, had a subtle, almost imperceptible downward slope. It wasn't enough to be obvious, but just enough to throw off your equilibrium, to make you feel a constant, low-grade sense of falling forward. The walls were bare stone, and they seemed to angle inwards ever so slightly as the passage progressed, amplifying the feeling of confinement. It was utterly baffling from a design perspective. It ended not with a door or another room, but a solid wall of mortared brick, identical to the side walls. There was no light fixture, no window. It was a dead end. A pointless, disorienting stub of a hallway. I ran my hand along the brickwork. It was cold and solid. I knocked on it, no hollow sound. I checked the blueprints again. It was there, exactly as I saw it. A passage to nowhere. Why would any architect, even an eccentric one, design this? It served no purpose. It didn't connect anything. It just was. A small, unsettling architectural sentence that ended without a point. Standing there in the gloom, with the weight of the silent house around me, I felt a faint draft on the back of my neck, yet I couldn't find its source. I dismissed it as a quirk, a folly of a rich man playing at being an architect. But as I walked back into the kitchen, the feeling of unease lingered, cold and persistent, like the ocean mist outside. Alistair Lancaster believed a house should be an experience. I was beginning to worry just what kind of experience he had in mind. The late October air over Boston's Beacon Hill was crisp, smelling of decaying leaves and the faint, promising scent of chimney smoke. For Liam Callahan, perched 3 stories up on a scaffold, it was the smell of a job well done. He ran a gloved hand over the newly repointed brickwork of the Ellison House, a magnificent federal-style townhouse he had spent the last 4 months painstakingly bringing back from the brink of genteel ruin. The work was meticulous, honest. The house had sagged with age, its timbers groaning under the weight of nearly 2 centuries, but there was no malice in its decay. It was simply tired. "She'll stand for another 200 years, Mr. Callahan," a cheerful voice called from the street below. It was David Ellison, the homeowner, a retired history professor with an infectious passion for his property. The original builders would be proud. Liam smiled, pulling down his dust mask. "They did all the hard work, David. I'm just patching things up." He felt a deep satisfaction in this work, a communion with the past. To him, these old buildings were living things, repositories of stories. His job was to listen to them, to understand their language of stress fractures and water stains, and to heal them with respect for their original integrity. The Ellison house had spoken of neglect, of seasons of hard rain and ice, but its bones were good. Its secrets were simple ones: a child's marble lost under a floorboard, a forgotten love letter tucked into a wall cavity, benign ghosts of everyday life. Later that evening, back in his small, cluttered apartment in the North End that doubled as his office, the feeling of accomplishment lingered. Architectural drawings and historical survey maps were stacked on every available surface. The Ellison blueprints were rolled up and tied with a ribbon, ready to be archived. He was in that rare, peaceful lull between projects, a space he usually filled with research and prospecting for the next structural puzzle. As the city lights began to glitter outside his window, the phone rang, piercing the quiet. The number was unfamiliar, a long-distance area code he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail, but a professional instinct made him pick it up on the 3rd ring. "Callahan," he answered, his voice still coated in a fine layer of brick dust. There was a brief pause, filled only with a faint, empty static, as if the call were coming from a cavernous, empty room. Then a woman's voice spoke. It was low, precise, and utterly devoid of warmth. "Is this Liam Callahan, the restoration architect?" "It is. To whom am I speaking?" "My name is Evelyn Lancaster." She said the name as if it were a statement of fact, requiring no further embellishment or context. "I require your services for an assessment of my family's estate in Northwood, Blackwood Manor." Liam frowned, leaning over his desk to grab a pen and a notepad. Northwood. The name was vaguely familiar. A rural town somewhere in the western part of the state, nestled in the hills. The kind of place people left, not the kind of place that housed estates requiring specialist restorers. The name of the manor itself felt heavy, theatrical. "Blackwood Manor," he repeated. "I'm not familiar with it." "Few are," she replied, and the finality in her tone shut down any further inquiry. "The structure has been unattended for some time. There is significant decay. I need a comprehensive report on its structural viability and a preliminary scope for preservation." Not renovation. Preservation? Her choice of words intrigued him. It was the language of a purist, a language he respected. Yet her voice was a flatline, a sterile instrument delivering information. There were no pleasantries, no small talk, no apologies for the cold call. It was a transaction. "I see," Liam said, his curiosity piqued despite her coldness. "An estate of that nature would require an in-person visit. My schedule is just clearing up. I could potentially drive out late next week." "Be here Tuesday." 10 in the morning, she commanded, not requested. I will provide you with the address. Do not be late. Before he could confirm or ask for details, the line went dead. Liam sat in the sudden silence of his office, the receiver still pressed to his ear. He stared at the name he had scribbled on his notepad, Evelyn Lancaster, Blackwood Manor. He had dealt with eccentric clients before. It came with the territory of stewarding the homes of the wealthy and historic. But this was different. This wasn't eccentricity, it was a chilling absence of it, a void of normal human interaction. He slowly placed the phone back in its cradle. The warm satisfaction from the Ellison House project began to cool, replaced by a thread of unease. He turned to his computer and typed Blackwood Manor, Northwood into the search bar. The results were sparse. A few mentions in old county records, no photographs, no real estate listings. Just a pin on a map, deep in a patch of dense woodland, miles from the nearest town. A house that wanted to be forgot. And a woman who, for reasons of her own, was about to invite him inside. The following morning, a thick, silver mist rolled in from the Atlantic, swallowing the coastline and muffling the world in a damp, gray silence. It clung to Blackwood Manor, making the dark granite and pointed gables seem like they were floating in an endless sea of clouds. The unease from the pointless corridor had followed me home to my small rented cottage, seeping into my dreams. It was no longer just a strange architectural quirk. It was a question I couldn't leave unanswered. I returned to the manor with a new resolve, my professional curiosity now sharpened by a sliver of genuine fear. Eleanor was absent, her car gone from the long, sweeping driveway. The house was mine for the day. I decided to abandon the service wing and focus on the main residence, where the family lived and entertained. If Arthur Lancaster's eccentricities were present in the utilitarian parts of the house, what had he done in the grander spaces? I started in the library. It was a cavernous, two-story room, paneled entirely in dark, almost black oak. A gallery ran along the upper level, and the shelves were crammed with leather-bound books that looked as if they hadn't been touched in a century. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and wood polish. It was the kind of room designed to impress, to project an image of wealth and intellect. It was also the perfect place to hide something. This time, I wouldn't rely on just the blueprints and my own eyes. I unpacked my Leica laser distance measurer, a tool for surgical precision. I would map the room myself and compare it to the plans Eleanor had provided. I started with the room's length. The laser dot danced on the far wall. Click. The measurement appeared on the small screen. I cross-referenced it with the blueprints. It matched. I measured the width. Click. Another match. Everything was perfect, disarmingly so. My paranoia began to feel foolish. Then I measured the west wall, the one that separated the library from a series of small parlors. According to the blueprints, it was a standard load-bearing wall, thick but not unusually so. My external measurements, taken from the parlors and the hallway, confirmed its total thickness. But when I measured the library's interior dimensions again, this time focusing specifically on that wall's length, the numbers didn't add up. There was a discrepancy. Nearly 3 feet of space was unaccounted for along the entire 30-foot length of the wall. It was a void, a deliberate thickness that served no structural purpose. My heart began to beat a low, heavy drum against my ribs. This was different from the sloping passage. This was a calculated deception. The blueprints were a lie. I walked over to the wall, running my hands over the ornate wood panels. They were seamless, masterfully joined. I started tapping gently, my knuckles rapping against the cold oak. Tap, 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 a solid, dense sound. I moved down the wall, my taps becoming more insistent. Tap, tap, thud, the sound changed. It was subtle but unmistakable. A hollow resonance deep within the wood. I focused on that section, my eyes scanning every inch of the intricate carvings of vines and gargoyles that decorated the panels. My fingers traced the lines, searching for a seam, a latch, a button. It was a puzzle box, and I was certain Arthur Lancaster had designed it to be solved. My fingers brushed against a small, carved rosette tucked away in a corner of a panel, almost hidden by the deeper shadows. It felt different from the others, not quite flush with the wood. I pressed it. Nothing. Frustration mounted. I was so close. I looked at the bookshelf built into the wall nearby. An old adage came to mind. I started examining the books, thick tomes on philosophy, history, maritime law. Halfway down one shelf was a copy of Poe's Tales of Mystery and Imagination. It seemed fitting. On a whim, I pulled it. It didn't move. I tried to tilt it. As my hand pressed down on the spine, I felt a faint, mechanical click from within the wall. A low groan of wood on wood followed, and the entire section of bookshelf beside me swung silently inward, revealing a pitch-black opening. The air that wafted out was ancient and cold, carrying a smell of dust and stagnant decay that was far more potent than the general mustiness of the house. I fumbled for my high-lumen flashlight, my hand shaking slightly. I aimed the beam into the darkness. It wasn't a room. It was another passage, narrow and stone-lined, barely wide enough for one person to squeeze through. Unlike the service corridor, this one was clearly not for servants. It was a secret, a vein running through the heart of the house. This was no longer about eccentricity. This was about concealment. Alarm, cold and sharp, cut through me. The blueprints weren't just inaccurate, they were a fabrication designed to hide these spaces. Why? Who were these passages for? To spy? To escape? Or to make someone disappear? My mind raced back to Aline's cold demeanor, her strange insistence on preserving the house's experience. I knew I couldn't proceed without more information. That night, back in the safety of my cottage, with the sound of the foghorn as a lonely companion, I turned to my laptop. I pushed aside architectural databases and opened a browser, typing Blackwood Manor Lancaster Family Maine into the search bar. I sifted through articles about their shipping empire and high society events. Then, buried in the digital archives of a local newspaper, the Harbor Herald, dated October 1928, I found it. A small, brief article. The headline read, "Tragedy at Blackwood Manor. Visiting cousin presumed lost to sea." A young woman named Charlotte Ainsley, Aline's great-aunt, had been staying at the manor and vanished during a storm. Her disappearance was ruled a tragic accident, but the article mentioned one detail that made the hair on my arms stand up. She was last seen entering the library. The late October air in Boston's Beacon Hill had a crisp, triumphant bite to it, mirroring the satisfaction that settled deep in my bones. I stood across the street from the Atherton house, a 3-story federal-style townhouse I had spent the last 8 months coaxing back from the brink of dereliction. The newly laid brick of the facade glowed a warm, ruddy ochre in the afternoon sun. The restored wrought iron fence stood sentinel once more. And behind the gleaming, multi-paned windows, a family was turning a historical shell back into a home. This was my life's work, my passion. Breathing life back into forgotten structures, honoring the ghosts of craftsmen by preserving their legacy. I wasn't just an architect. I was a historian with a toolkit, a storyteller who used blueprints instead of words. My phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my reverie. I answered, expecting a call from my supplier about the reclaimed heart pine flooring for my next project in the South End. Liam Callahan speaking. A beat of silence, filled only with a faint, crackling static, as if the call was coming from a great distance or a bygone era. Then a woman's voice, flat and devoid of warmth, cut through the line. "Is this the restoration architect?" "It is," I replied, a professional smile in my voice that she couldn't see. "How can I help you?" "I have a property," she stated, not asked. The words were clipped precise. "Blackwood Manor. It is located in Northwood. It requires an assessment. Structural integrity, primarily." I shifted my weight, my gaze still on the Atherton house. "Blackwood Manor," I repeated, rolling the name around in my mind. It sounded like something from a Gothic novel, stark and imposing. "I'm not familiar with it, or with Northwood. Can you tell me a bit about the building? Its age, architectural style?" Another pause. I could almost picture her on the other end, a severe figure in a dimly lit room, annoyed by my attempts at professional courtesy. "It's old," she said finally, the words carrying a weight of finality. "And it's falling apart. That is all the information pertinent to your initial assessment. My name is Evelyn Lancaster." I scribbled the name and location on a notepad I always carried. Northwood, I'd have to look it up, but it sounded remote, tucked away in the western part of the state, where the towns grew smaller and the forests grew thicker. "Miss Lancaster, I'd be happy to discuss a potential assessment. My schedule is a bit tight, but perhaps in a few weeks." "I require you here this Friday," she interrupted, the statement an order, not a request. I blinked, taken aback by her audacity. "This Friday? That's only 3 days' notice. That's highly irregular. We haven't discussed terms, scope of work, or my fee structure." "Your fee is irrelevant. It will be met," she said, dismissing my practical concerns with an unnerving ease. A gust of wind rustled the golden leaves of a nearby maple, and for a moment, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "Your reputation for discretion and thoroughness precedes you, Mr. Callahan. You are recommended as the best. I will not entertain the second best. Be here on Friday. The address will be sent to your phone." Before I could formulate another protest or ask a single clarifying question, the line went dead. I stood on the bustling Boston sidewalk, the sounds of the city, the distant siren, the rumble of the T, the chatter of passers-by, fading into a dull hum. The call had been jarring, a shard of ice dropped into the warm satisfaction of my day. Evelyn Lancaster, Blackwood Manor, Northwood. The names themselves felt like a warning. Later that evening, in my apartment overlooking the Charles River, I found Northwood on a map. It was exactly where I'd pictured it. A small, isolated dot surrounded by vast tracts of state forest, hours from any major city. There were few pictures online, mostly of a quaint, unremarkable town center. Of Blackwood Manor, there was nothing. No historical society mentions, no real estate listings, no architectural blogs. It was a ghost. Every practical instinct screamed at me to decline. The short notice, the client's abrasive and secretive nature, the sheer isolation of the project. It was a recipe for a logistical and professional nightmare. But the architect in me, the historian, was hooked. A house with no digital footprint. A family that demanded the best but offered no information. A structure named Blackwood Manor. It was an enigma wrapped in crumbling brick and decaying timber, and the puzzle of it was an irresistible lure. Against my better judgment, I texted the number back a single word. Confirmed. My phone immediately pinged with a location pin dropped in the middle of a dense, unpopulated forest. I felt a knot of apprehension tighten in my stomach, but it was overshadowed by the undeniable pull of the unknown. I was going to Northwood. I had to see the house that time, and the internet had forgotten. The digital glow of the microfiche reader cast a pale, sickly light on Liam's face, illuminating the stark headline from 1928. Local woman vanishes from storied Lancaster estate. Charlotte Ainsley, last seen in the library. His gaze shifted from the screen to the dark, narrow void behind the bookshelf. The two realities, the cold digital text and the cold physical space, merged into one terrifying conclusion. This wasn't a quirk of architecture. It was a tomb in waiting. Sleep offered no escape that night. Every creak of the old manor, every sigh of the wind whistling through the eaves, sounded like a footstep in the dark or a muffled cry. By dawn, a cold resolve had settled over him, as grim and gray as the main coastline outside his window. He couldn't ignore this. He had to go in. Professional habit kicked in, a familiar bulwark against the rising tide of fear. This was an unknown, potentially unstable space. He drove into the nearby town of Camden, the salt-laced air doing little to clear his head. At a local hardware store, he bought what he needed: a high-lumen LED headlamp, a canister of filtered dust masks, thick work gloves, and on a grim impulse, a small pry bar. He felt less like an architect and more like a spelunker preparing to descend into a place from which he might not return. He packed a water bottle and some protein bars, his mind automatically running through a safety checklist, that felt chillingly inadequate for what he was about to do. He waited until late afternoon, when he knew Alina was on her weekly trip into town for supplies and social calls. The house was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the main hall, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat counting down to his discovery. In the library, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and leather. With a deep breath, he activated the mechanism. The bookshelf swung inward with a low groan of protest, revealing the abyss. Clipping the headlamp on, he pulled the mask over his face. The beam cut a sharp, white cone into the oppressive darkness. The air that drifted out was ancient and profoundly still, carrying a metallic scent of stone and decay. He squeezed into the opening, his shoulders brushing against the cold, rough-hewn rock on either side. The moment the bookshelf clicked shut behind him, plunging him into absolute blackness save for his light, a primal wave of claustrophobia washed over him. He fought it down, focusing on his breathing, the rasp of it loud in the confined space. The passage was even narrower than he'd imagined. It snaked left, then right, a deliberate design to disorient anyone inside. The floor was uneven flagstone, slick with a fine layer of dust that puffed up around his boots with every step. Cobwebs, thick as cotton, brushed against his face. His light caught the glint of something on the floor ahead. He knelt, his gloved fingers carefully brushing away the dust. It was a small, silver locket, tarnished with age. He pried it open with a thumbnail. Inside, the tiny frames were empty, but the back was delicately engraved with the initials, C.A. Charlotte Ainsley. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down his spine. He pocketed the locket, the metal cool against his palm. He was on her path. This was where she had walked, terrified, into the dark. He pressed on, the passage growing steadily damper. A faint smell of rot and wet earth grew stronger. The passage didn't lead to another wing or an exit. It ended, abruptly, at a solid wall of mortared bricks. It was a dead end, a trap. There was no escape. Panic flared in his chest again, hot and sharp. Why build a passage that went nowhere? Unless the point wasn't to go through it, but to be left in it. His light scanned the walls, the floor, the ceiling. There, in a small alcove near the bottom of the final wall, was a pile of what looked like rotted fabric and leather. He crouched, using the tip of the pry bar to gently shift the decaying material. Beneath it was a small, leather-bound book. A diary. Its cover was warped and stained from the damp, but it was miraculously intact. His heart hammered against his ribs. He had found her voice. With trembling hands, he picked it up, tucking it securely inside his jacket. There was nothing else. Just the locket, the diary, and the suffocating finality of the brick wall. He backed away slowly, his headlamp beam dancing nervously over the stone. He didn't turn his back on the dead end until he was back at the entrance. He fumbled with the release mechanism, relief flooding through him as the bookshelf swung open, spilling the library's muted light into his tomb. He scrambled out, covered in dust and sweat, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He sealed the passage, the click of the lock sounding like a death sentence being commuted. Back in his room, he laid the two items on his desk, the tarnished silver locket and the damp, fragile diary. They were no longer artifacts of a bygone era. They were evidence. He had uncovered a secret hidden in plain sight, a story of cruelty written in stone and mortar. And now, he held the key to telling it. The storm broke just as I returned to my room, the first drops of rain lashing against the window pane like frantic fingers. My own fingers trembled as I placed the small, leather-bound diary on the antique writing desk. The air in the room was cold, but sweat trickled down my spine. The silver locket, now tucked safely in my pocket, felt impossibly heavy. I sat down, the worn chair groaning under my weight, and took a deep breath, the scent of old paper and dust filling my lungs. For a moment, I just stared at the diary. This wasn't a historical artifact anymore. It was a witness. With cautious hands, I opened it. The first few pages were written in a delicate, looping cursive, filled with the optimism of a young woman visiting family. Charlotte Ainsley had arrived at Blackwood Manor in the spring of 1928. Her early entries spoke of the rugged beauty of the Maine coast and her initial admiration for her uncle, Alastair Lancaster, Eleanor's grandfather. She called him a genius of structure, marveling at the manor's grandeur. But as spring turned to summer, the tone began to shift. An undercurrent of unease crept into her elegant script. May 12, 1928, she wrote, "Uncle Alastair showed me the service wing today. There is a corridor there that makes no sense. It leads nowhere. He laughed when I asked of its purpose, calling it a folly of perspective. But when I walked down it, I felt dizzy, as if the walls were closing in. It was not a pleasant feeling. He watched me the entire time, his eyes unblinking. My own blood ran cold. She had seen it, too. I kept reading, flipping through pages where the handwriting grew tighter, more hurried. June 3, 1928. I feel a prisoner in this beautiful cage. The doors have locks that feel too sturdy, the windows too high. Alastair speaks constantly of the house as a living thing, a perfect system designed for security and permanence. He prides himself on its secrets. Yesterday, he boasted that not even a mouse could find its way out of Blackwood if he did not wish it. Then came the entry that made my heart hammer against my ribs. It was dated just 2 weeks before the date on the newspaper article. July 1st, 1928. I have found his secret. I was in the library trying to find a book on botany when I leaned against the large bookshelf. It moved. Only a fraction, but it moved. Later, when Alastair was out, I examined it more closely. There is a latch, hidden within the carving of a lion's head. He designed a hidden way, but it is not an escape. It is something else. I feel it. This house is not a home. It is his masterpiece of control. He watches me. I see him in the halls, in the gardens. He is testing his creation, and I am the subject. The final entries were a frantic scrawl, words bleeding into one another. July 14th, 1928. He knows I know. I saw him watching me from his study window as I paced the grounds. His smile, it was not kind. It was triumphant. I must leave. I cannot stay another night. I will pack a small bag. If I am not heard from again, know that Alastair Lancaster did this. This diary is my only voice. I will hide it where he would never think to look, inside his own trap. That was the last entry. A profound silence filled my room, broken only by the howling wind and the relentless drumming of rain. He had built a tomb, and she had walked right into it, leaving her testimony behind. Alastair hadn't just been an eccentric architect. He was a predator who used his craft to ensnare and eliminate a young woman who had uncovered his monstrous nature. Suddenly, a soft knock echoed on my door. I jumped, slamming the diary shut. My mind raced. Where could I hide it? There was nowhere. The knock came again, sharper this time. "Mr. Harding, are you still awake?" It was Eleanor. Her voice, calm and collected, sliced through the storm's fury. "One moment," I called out, my voice strained. I shoved the diary under a stack of blueprints on the desk, my hands fumbling. I stood up, trying to compose myself, and walked to the door. When I opened it, she stood there holding a silver tray with a steaming mug. "I thought you might appreciate some tea on a night like this," she said, her eyes sweeping past me to scan the room. They were Alastair's eyes, I realized, sharp, calculating. The storm can be quite unsettling if you're not used to it. "That's very thoughtful, Mrs. Lancaster. Thank you," I said, taking the mug. My hand was shaking slightly. Her gaze lingered on the desk, on the messy pile of blueprints where the diary was hidden in plain sight. "Working late, I see. Making progress?" "Just reviewing some structural details," I lied, my heart pounding a deafening rhythm. "Trying to fully appreciate your grandfather's vision." A thin smile touched her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. He was a brilliant man. He believed a house should be a fortress, protecting the family's integrity above all else. A legacy of stone and secrets. She held my gaze for a moment longer, an unspoken challenge passing between us. "Well, don't let me disturb you. Good night, Mr. Harding." She turned and walked away, her footsteps receding down the hall. I closed the door, leaning my forehead against the cool wood, my breath coming in ragged gasps. She knew. She didn't know what I knew, but her visit wasn't a kindness. It was a warning. I was no longer just an architect restoring a house. I was an intruder who had stumbled upon the family's darkest secret, and its guardian was watching my every move. The drive from Boston had been a gradual descent into isolation. Liam Callahan watched as the familiar brick and brownstone of the city gave way to sprawling suburbs, then quaint New England towns, and finally, to the dense, brooding forests of rural Massachusetts. The final turnoff for Northwood was an unmarked road that seemed to swallow his car whole, the canopy of ancient oaks and maples knitting together overhead, plunging the path into a premature twilight. The air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. This was the kind of place that didn't just exist. It endured, hiding its secrets under a blanket of moss and shadow. Blackwood Manor appeared suddenly, crowning a low hill that overlooked the surrounding woods like a forgotten monarch. It wasn't a ruin, not yet, but it was in a state of profound and melancholy decay. The slate roof sagged in the middle, creating a concave line like a broken spine. Dark, irregular stains, legacies of 1,000 storms, wept down the granite facade from the sills of vacant windows. A skeletal trellis, long since shed of its roses, clung desperately to one wall. As an architectural restorer, Liam had seen neglect before, but this felt different. This was a house actively surrendering to the wilderness, and the wilderness was winning. He parked his sensible sedan on a gravel drive that was more weed than stone and stepped out. The silence was immediate and profound, broken only by the distant caw of a crow. Before he could even approach the massive oak door, it swung inward. A woman stood silhouetted in the dim entryway. Evelyn Lancaster. She was tall and severe, her dark hair pulled back in a tight, unadorned bun. She wore a simple gray dress that seemed to absorb the light around her. There was no welcome in her eyes, only a flat, pragmatic assessment. "Mr. Callahan, you're punctual." "Miss Lancaster," Liam replied, extending a hand that she ignored. "Thank you for seeing me." "The house is the reason you are here, not me," she said, her voice as crisp and devoid of warmth as the autumn air. She turned and walked inside, leaving him to follow. The issues are extensive. Water damage in the west wing, foundation subsidence on the north side, and the roof, as you have likely observed, is failing. Liam stepped across the threshold, and the oppressive atmosphere of the exterior intensified. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust, mildew, and something else, something acrid and old, like stagnant memories. A grand staircase swept upwards into darkness, its banister coated in a fine layer of grime. Furniture huddled under white sheets like a congregation of ghosts. He began his formal assessment, his professional training a comforting shield against the house's palpable gloom. He made notes on his tablet, documenting the warped floorboards, the plaster crumbling from the ceilings, the telltale signs of rot in the window frames. Evelyn shadowed him, silent and watchful, her presence a constant, unnerving pressure at his back. She offered no anecdotes, no family history, no sentimentality. It was a purely transactional inspection of a failing structure. It was in the library that Liam's professional curiosity sharpened into genuine suspicion. The room was magnificent, or had been once. Two-story shelves, now sparsely populated with leather-bound books blooming with mold, lined 3 of the walls. A massive, soot-blackened fireplace dominated the 4th, but as he measured the room's dimensions, his brow furrowed. The exterior wall, the one with the fireplace, felt wrong. He ran his hand along the plaster beside the hearth. It was cold, solid, but his architect's intuition screamed that it was too thick. A non-load-bearing wall of this era shouldn't have this much mass. "Is there a chimney flue for a stove on the 2nd floor that runs through here?" he asked, tapping the wall. Evelyn, standing near the doorway, didn't move. "No," Liam pressed on. "It's just the depth here is unusual. It's nearly 4 feet thick. There's no structural reason for it." As he spoke, he felt it, a faint but persistent draft, impossibly cold, seeping from the base of the wall. He crouched, running his fingers along the seam where the plaster met the floorboards. The draft was stronger here. He checked the window frames. They were sealed tight with age and grime. The fireplace flue was blocked. There was no source. "There's a draft," he stated, looking up at her. "It seems to be coming from inside the wall." For the first time, an emotion flickered in Evelyn Lancaster's eyes, but it wasn't surprise or concern. It was a flat, chilling indifference, as if he'd merely pointed out a cobweb. She already knew. A knot of dread tightened in Liam's stomach. This wasn't just a house with problems. It was a house with secrets. Malicious, intentional secrets hidden in plain sight. He looked from the impossibly thick wall to the cold, distant woman who was its keeper. He knew then, with a certainty that chilled him more than any draft, that he had to take this job. The puzzle of Blackwood Manor was not one of neglect, but of design. The autumn that followed felt like a long, slow exhale. The media frenzy had finally subsided, the headlines fading from House of Horrors to yesterday's news. Blackwood Manor stood silent on its hill, no longer a private residence, but a sealed monument to a dark legacy. Its perimeter wrapped in the stark yellow of police tape. I stood at the edge of the property line, the chill November wind rustling the dead leaves at my feet. Detective Miller, a weary man whose shoulders seemed permanently slouched by the weight of the case, stood beside me, sipping coffee from a paper cup. "Forensics finished their sweep last week," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Found traces in the sealed corridor, the one you opened first. Hair, fabric fibers, degraded organic matter. Not enough for a DNA match after all this time, but enough to corroborate the journals." The journals. Found in a false-bottomed safe behind the master bedroom's fireplace. A discovery made only after I cross-referenced the original 1880 blueprints with my own meticulous measurements. They were the key. Generations of Lancasters, in neat, dispassionate script, had logged the manor's modifications and their uses. The narrow corridor was an oubliette, a place to trap a business rival during a staged hunting accident. A cleverly redirected flue pipe in the guest wing could fill the room with carbon monoxide, silencing a cousin who threatened to expose a financial scandal. The grand staircase had a load-bearing pin that could be discreetly retracted from a hidden alcove, a solution for a litigious contractor. The house wasn't just a home, it was a weapon honed and refined by each successive generation. "It was a tradition," I murmured, the words tasting like ash. "A way of maintaining control. A way of being monsters," Miller corrected grimly. He took another sip of coffee. "Evelyn's a true Lancaster. When we presented her with the ledgers, with your architectural breakdown showing how every accident corresponded with a modification to the house, she didn't even flinch." I remembered that moment vividly. We were in the manor's cold, sterile drawing room. The evidence was laid out on the antique coffee table, my blueprints, the journals, the forensic reports. Evelyn had looked at it all with the same detached curiosity she'd shown me when I first pointed out the draft in the library. There was no denial, no outrage, only a quiet, chilling appraisal. When the officers moved to handcuff her, she finally looked at me. Her gaze was not one of hatred, but of profound, dismissive disappointment, as if I were a tradesman who had failed to grasp the point of his work. "You broke it," she had said, her voice even. "It was a perfect machine. You're just a handyman, Mr. Callahan. You couldn't appreciate the design." Those words had followed me for months. She saw herself as the custodian of a masterpiece, not the heir to a legacy of murder. The trial would be a formality. Her own family's words would convict her. "What happens to the house?" I asked Miller, looking up at its darkened windows. "It's a toxic asset. The state will seize it. Most likely, it'll be condemned and demolished. Some things are too broken to fix." He crushed his cup and tossed it into a nearby bin. "You did a good thing, Liam. You gave a lot of ghosts a voice." I wasn't sure I believed in ghosts, but I understood what he meant. The forgotten victims, their disappearances explained away as misfortunes or desertions, finally had their story told. 6 months later, the sun streamed into my Boston office, illuminating dust motes dancing in the light. The space was modern, clean, with white walls and glass partitions. It was the antithesis of Blackwood Manor. Spread across my drafting table were the blueprints for my new project. The renovation of a fire-damaged public library in a low-income neighborhood. It was about creating space, about letting light in, about building something for a community. I ran my hand over the crisp paper, the familiar texture a comfort. The experience with the Lancasters had changed me. I no longer saw buildings as just structures of wood and stone, but as containers of human experience, capable of holding both darkness and light. My job wasn't just to restore the past, but to ensure it paved the way for a better future. The phone on my desk rang. I looked at the caller ID, a new client, a historical society hoping to restore a colonial-era courthouse. I picked it up, a sense of quiet purpose settling over me. "Liam Callahan speaking," I said, my voice steady and clear. The ghosts of Northwood were quiet now, and I had new walls to build. Before the silence of Blackwood Manor, there was the familiar hum of my life in Portland. My office, a restored loft space in the Old Port, was my sanctuary. It smelled of old paper, drafting ink, and the strong coffee that fueled my late nights. Sunlight streamed through the large, arched window, illuminating dust motes dancing over stacks of architectural histories and neatly rolled blueprints. I was an architect, but more than that, a preservationist. My passion wasn't in erecting glass and steel monoliths, but in listening to the stories old buildings had to tell, in tracing the lines drawn by hands long gone and giving them a future. I was just finishing a meticulous restoration of a 19th century maritime captain's house in Kennebunkport, a project that had been satisfying but straightforward. Now, an unwelcome idleness had settled in. I found myself scrolling through potential projects, dismissing most of them. They lacked soul, a history that challenged and inspired. They were jobs, not callings. It was during one of these aimless afternoons that the email arrived. The subject line was stark and formal: Architectural Consultation Request, Blackwood Manor. The sender was a law firm representing the Lancaster family estate. The message was brief, almost sterile. It spoke of a significant, multi-phase restoration of a private family residence on a remote stretch of the Maine coast. It mentioned the need for an architect with specific expertise in early 20th century Gilded Age construction, and most emphatically, an appreciation for preserving the original architect's unique vision. The final line stressed that absolute discretion was a non-negotiable term of employment. Intrigued, I did some preliminary digging. The Lancasters were old money, their fortune made in shipping and timber a century ago. They were notoriously private, rarely appearing in social columns or news reports. Blackwood Manor itself was a ghost online. There were no tourist photos, no historical society entries, just a few grainy aerial shots from decades past showing a sprawling, dark stone structure perched ominously on a cliff overlooking the churning Atlantic. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress, a stone sentinel guarding its own secrets. The original architect was listed as Alastair Lancaster, the family patriarch who had built it in the 1920s. An owner-architect, always a recipe for eccentricity. The challenge was irresistible. This wasn't just another job, it was a puzzle box, a piece of architectural history sealed off from the world. I replied, expressing my interest and attaching my portfolio. Things moved with surprising speed. Within a day, I was scheduled for a phone call with the current matriarch, Eleanor Lancaster. Her voice, when it came through the line, was exactly as I'd imagined the manor itself would sound if it could speak. It was low, crisp, and carried the unnerving stillness of a room that hadn't been disturbed in years. There were no pleasantries. "Mr. Harding," she began, her tone leaving no room for small talk. "Your work on the Allerton building in Bath is what drew our attention. You respected the original structure." "Thank you, Miss Lancaster. I believe a building's history is its most valuable asset," I replied, trying to sound both professional and passionate. "Precisely," she said. "Blackwood Manor is not merely a house, it is a testament to my grandfather's vision. It has peculiarities, features that a modern architect might deem inefficient or illogical. These are not to be corrected. They are to be preserved. Do you understand? I understand completely, I assured her. My job is to restore and reinforce, not to redesign. I work to honor the original intent. The words felt right, the creed I had built my career on. I had no idea then how sinister that original intent truly was. Good, she said, a faint note of something that might have been approval in her voice. The structure requires significant work, foundations, roofing, interior preservation. It is a large undertaking. You will be compensated generously for your time and your silence. The call ended as abruptly as it began. An employment contract, as sparse and demanding as her conversation, arrived an hour later. I signed it without hesitation. The mystery was too compelling. I spent the next few days gathering my equipment: laser measures, high-resolution cameras, my trusted notebooks, and specialized structural sensors. I looked at the preliminary floor plans they had sent, a sprawling, complex layout with wings that seemed to branch off at odd angles. I saw a challenge. I saw a masterpiece of eccentric design waiting to be understood. I saw the project of a lifetime. Packing my car on a gray, overcast morning, the salty air already thick with the promise of coastal fog, I felt a thrill of anticipation. I was driving toward a story, ready to listen to what the old house had to say. I had no idea it was a story of a cage, and that its walls would soon be listening to me. The salt-laced fog was a thick, gray curtain, and my sedan's headlights barely pierced it. For the last 20 miles, the main coastline had grown more rugged, more isolated, the road narrowing as it hugged the cliffs. Civilization had peeled away, replaced by gnarled pines and the incessant roar of the Atlantic crashing against unseen rocks below. I'm Liam Harding, an architectural preservationist from Portland. I'm used to the moods of the Maine coast, but this felt different. This felt like crossing a border into another country. The contract was the strangest I'd ever seen. The pay was astronomical enough to set up my own firm, but the terms were rigid and secretive. Blackwood Manor. A reclusive family, the Lancasters, and a single, cryptic instruction from the matriarch, Eleanor Lancaster. Preserve the unique vision of my grandfather, Alastair Lancaster. His work is not to be questioned, only restored. Then the manor emerged from the mist, and I understood the need for such a clause. It wasn't a house, it was a declaration. A Gothic revival behemoth of dark granite, it clawed at the cliffside, its gables and turrets like sharpened teeth against the bruised sky. It was magnificent and monstrous all at once, a structure at war with the very landscape it occupied. I parked the car on the gravel drive, the sound swallowed by the wind. Before my hand could touch the massive oak door, it swung inward. She stood there, framed by the darkness of the foyer. Eleanor Lancaster was exactly as I'd pictured her. Tall, rail-thin, with a posture so rigid it seemed carved from stone. Her silver hair was pulled into a severe bun, and she wore a tailored tweed suit that looked both priceless and 50 years out of date. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, assessed me with unnerving precision. "Mr. Harding, you're punctual. I appreciate that." Her voice was crisp, devoid of warmth, the syllables clipped. "Mrs. Lancaster," I nodded, stepping inside. The air shifted, growing heavy and still, thick with the scent of old wood, beeswax, and the faint, briny dampness of the sea. The foyer was cavernous, paneled in dark mahogany, with a grand staircase that coiled upwards into shadow. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors watched from the walls, their painted eyes following me. My grandfather, Alastair, built this house as a testament to his philosophies on space and living, she said, her voice echoing slightly in the hall. He was a visionary. His design is not to be corrected or improved by modern sensibilities. It is to be preserved. Is that understood? Perfectly, I replied. My job is to understand the architect's original intent and ensure it endures. Her expression didn't soften. Good, your discretion is not a request. It is a condition of your employment. She began a brisk tour of the main floor, pointing out structural areas that needed attention, water damage on a ceiling, cracks in the plaster of the grand dining room. But it was when I asked about the service wing that her composure flickered. "That area is of little importance," she said dismissively. "Focus on the public-facing rooms. To understand the building's load-bearing structure, I need to survey it completely," I insisted, keeping my tone professional. "From the foundation up." A flash of annoyance crossed her face before being suppressed. "Very well." She led me down a narrow passage into what was clearly the servants' part of the house. The opulence vanished, replaced by stark plaster and worn floorboards. And then I saw it. A corridor leading off the main service hall. It looked wrong. I walked toward it, an odd sensation prickling my senses. What was the purpose of this hallway? Elinor stopped. Alastair had his follies. I stepped into it. The feeling intensified. The floor, while appearing level, had a subtle but definite downward slope, throwing my balance off just enough to be disorienting. I walked slowly, placing my hand on the wall. It felt closer than it should. I glanced back. The entrance seemed wider than the space I was now in. My architectural instincts screamed that something was fundamentally incorrect. It was a simple trick of forced perspective, but on a scale that was deeply unsettling. The corridor was maybe 40 feet long, and it ended not in a door or a staircase, but a solid, blank brick wall. It served no purpose. It led nowhere. It was an architectural dead end designed to confuse. I turned to Elinor, who watched me from the entrance with an unnervingly passive expression. "This is unusual," I said, trying to find the right word. "The narrowing perspective, the slope, it's intentionally disorienting. Why build it?" "As I said, an experiment, an architectural whim," she replied, her voice flat. "It is of no consequence. You will not be required to work in this section." She turned and walked away, her footsteps receding down the hall, leaving me alone in the mouth of the bizarre passage. I stood there, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Architects, especially visionaries like Alastair Lancaster was said to be, don't have expensive whims without reason. Every line, every angle has a purpose. As I stared into that useless, unsettling corridor, I couldn't shake the feeling that its purpose was not something I was meant to understand. The house wasn't just old, it felt sick. And for the first time, I felt a genuine tremor of fear about what I had just agreed to preserve. The air was a thick, choking cloud of dust and ancient, disturbed earth. The groan of stressed timbers echoed from above, a death rattle from the very bones of Blackwood Manor. Sarah coughed beside me, her flashlight beam cutting a frantic, dancing path through the darkness of the sealed wine cellar. Elinor's final, chilling words still hung in the space between us. Alastair appreciated a fine vintage and an even finer final resting place. Panic was a cold knot in my stomach, but my mind, sharpened by weeks of deciphering Alastair's madness, raced. "The walls," I gasped, running my hands over the cold, damp fieldstone. "These are original foundation walls. But that archway we came through, the brickwork was newer. From the 1920s, maybe." "She sealed us in, Liam." Sarah's voice trembled, but a journalist's resolve hardened her tone. "My phone has no signal. The files I sent, I hope they went through." "They did," I said, more to convince myself than her. "We just have to hold on." But I knew Elinor wouldn't wait for us to starve. The groaning from above was getting louder, more rhythmic. A pattern. She wasn't just sealing us in, she was bringing the floor down on top of us. My eyes darted around, following Sarah's light. I saw it then. A small iron grate near the floor, no larger than a shoebox. A drain? No, too high. It was a remnant of an older system, a dumbwaiter shaft or ventilation. Sarah, the light. Over here, I pried at the rusted grate with my fingers, the metal biting into my skin. It wouldn't budge. Ripping a loose metal shelf from a rotted wine rack, I used it as a lever. With a screech of tortured metal, the grate popped free. A rush of cooler, fresher air washed over my face. It was a ventilation shaft leading up. It was our only way out. "It's too small," she said, her hope deflating. "It's not for us," I replied, my mind making the final, desperate connection. It's for the pressure. I pointed at a massive, dust-caked oak wine barrel in the corner, one Alastair had likely prized. If we can break that, the fermentation gas, the pressure change, it might be enough to destabilize the new brickwork she used to seal the door. It's a long shot. It was our only shot. Together, we shoved and heaved, rolling the massive barrel across the uneven floor until it crashed against the sealed archway. The ancient wood groaned but held. We did it again, and again. On the fourth impact, a crack appeared in the mortar. On the fifth, a cascade of bricks tumbled inward. A moment later, we were scrambling through the opening, gasping for air in the service corridor, the sound of the cellar ceiling collapsing behind us a deafening roar. We didn't run for the front door. I knew better. We headed for the grand hall, the heart of the house, and there she was. Elena stood by the massive stone fireplace, a portrait of unnerving calm. She held a small, ornate silver box. "Impressive," she said, her voice devoid of surprise. "Alastair would have found you a worthy adversary, but this house always has one last move." I saw the mechanism she was holding. It wasn't in any of the blueprints I'd studied. It was a master control, a final, house-wide purge. "It's over, Elena," Sarah said, holding up her phone, its screen now showing a message sent confirmation. "The world knows. The police are on their way." Elena smiled, a truly terrifying sight. Police can't navigate what they can't understand. This house was built to protect its secrets. But I wasn't looking at her. I was looking past her, at the fireplace. At the flue handle, an oversized, ornate iron lever I'd previously dismissed as decorative. On the original plans, it was connected to the chimney damper. But I'd noticed a second, hidden schematic etched onto the back of a loose stone in the study. It was a contingency. Alastair, ever the paranoid narcissist, had built a trap for anyone who might try to use his traps against him. The flue handle didn't just close the chimney. It engaged a series of hidden gears that would lock down the entire grand hall, dropping steel plates over the doors and windows. "You're right," I said, taking a step toward the fireplace. He built it to protect its secrets, but he only ever trusted himself. Before she could react, I lunged forward and yanked down on the iron lever. The mechanism was stiff from disuse, but it moved with a deep, resonant thunk. Elena stared at me, confused for a single, glorious second. Then came the sound of grinding stone and sliding metal. Heavy steel plates slammed down over the main entrance and the windows, plunging the hall into near darkness, lit only by the faint emergency lights and our phones. We were locked in, but she was locked in with us. Her composure finally shattered. She rattled the main doors, her mask of cold superiority melting into raw fury. Her final trap was neutered. The house had turned on its mistress. We waited in the echoing silence for what felt like an eternity. Then we heard it. Distant sirens, growing steadily closer. They were followed by the thud of boots on the porch and the shouts of police. They couldn't get in, but they were here. Elena Lancaster was cornered in her own monument to cruelty. Months later, I sat with Sarah at a small cafe overlooking the sunny Portland harbor. A newspaper on the table showed a picture of Blackwood Manor, surrounded by demolition equipment. The headline read, "The Architectural Horrors of Blackwood Manor, a family's century of secrets exposed." Elena had been indicted, the evidence from Alastair's journals and the house itself proving undeniable. The bodies of at least 7 previously missing people had been recovered from its walls. "They're taking it apart piece by piece," Sarah said softly, "making sure no one can ever be hurt by it again." I nodded, sipping my coffee. The warmth was a welcome contrast to the permanent chill I felt whenever I thought of that place. The job had left a scar on my soul, but it had also given me a new sense of purpose. A building wasn't just wood and stone. It was a testament, a story. My job was no longer just about preservation. It was about bearing witness.